Welcome to Disaster Health and Sheltering. You should have watched the video, Part 1, Component 1, prior to opening this site. Please see the participant manual or return to the website for instructions for linking to the instruction video. My name is Janice Springer, and I am a Disaster Health Services nurse, a Disability Integration Advisor, and a subject matter expert for disaster shelter nursing, and one of the co-authors of this course. And I will be your narrator. I also want to give credit to my co-author, Dr. Cheryl Smith, who is Associate Professor, Clinical Professor at the College of Nursing at Arizona University, and also Dr. Sharon Stanley, former Chief Nurse for the American Red Cross and a visionary advocate for nursing in all branches of Red Cross service delivery. You may want to have a paper and a pen at hand for some of the slides that are set up for answering questions. There are several case presentations in this training. I also recommend that you download the CMIST form, C-M-I-S-T, the COT-to-COT flow sheet, and the aggregate morbidity forms to use and also take later to class when we do the live training. We'll review each of these forms today, and I think it will help you assimilate the information that I'm giving you. As you know, in nursing, every course has to have objectives, and our course objectives are to describe the role of a Red Cross Disaster Health Services volunteer, to review the health service commitments of a Red Cross worker, to describe some health services disaster relief settings, especially shelters where volunteers may be assigned, to assess disaster client needs, providing appropriate nursing care and client referral. We'll describe some possible challenges of working in the community after a disaster incident and some strategies for providing assistance to individuals with access and functional needs. And we will also be talking about how health services aligns with public health nursing. Imagine that you are in this town. Because of the consequences of disasters such as this, and this is a photo from a tornado in Alabama, disaster preparedness has become a critical component in the professional development of nursing students. Since 2009, the American Association of Colleges of Nursing has required emergency preparedness and disaster management content in baccalaureate programs that are accredited by AACN. In addition, nursing programs urge strong community service components. Red Cross has a national student nurse program whereby hundreds and potentially thousands of nursing students will be better prepared for disaster response as spontaneous volunteers, and absolutely we hope some of you will enroll as Red Cross nurse volunteers. This training is one part of that program. The Red Cross is organized by chapters, regions, and has 7 divisions. We respond to over 70,000 disasters a year, and most of them are local disasters, like single-family fires in the home, multi-family fires in apartments, and local flooding. The local chapter is the foundation of Red Cross service, where the rubber meets the road, and without strong chapters and local volunteers, such as yourselves, the American Red Cross cannot carry out its mission. Red Cross is an organization that establishes response and fulfills its mission with 95% volunteers, 5% full-time employees. Volunteers define the organization and sustain communities in disaster. Red Cross principles are actually similar in many ways to principles of public health nursing, and these foundational 7 principles are the guiding principles for all of the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies all over the planet. One of the critical first ones is humanitarianism. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement brings assistance without discrimination to the wounded on the battlefield, endeavors, and its international and national capacity to prevent and alleviate human suffering wherever it may be found. Its purpose is to protect life and health and to ensure respect for the human being. And it promotes mutual understanding, friendship, cooperation, and lasting peace among all peoples. Red Cross is impartial. There is no discrimination as to nationality, race, religious beliefs, class, or political opinions. It is neutral in order to continue to enjoy the confidence of all. We may not take sides in hostilities, so that's why you sometimes see Red Cross in war areas as the neutral party. The Red Cross movement is independent, so each national society is independent to choose what parts of the Red Cross they are able to support. It is voluntary service. So back to the previous slide where 95% of us are actually volunteers, including myself. There can only be one Red Cross or one Crescent Society in any one country. That is to provide unity. But for universality, it is one movement in which all societies have equal status and share equal responsibilities and duties in helping one another worldwide. So that is why sometimes when there's an international disaster, you will hear that Red Cross from the USA or from Canada or from Israel are there helping. The video you watched earlier was to introduce you to the foundation that nurses built for the American Red Cross organization. Over 20,000 nurses remain a part of the Red Cross to this day, and as we mentioned, its mission is a humanitarian organization led by volunteers, guided by its congressional charter, and the fundamental principles of the International Red Cross movement will provide relief to victims of disaster and help people prevent, prepare for, and respond to emergencies. So that's the mission statement for the disaster portion of American Red Cross. And student nurses are recognized as full members of the Disaster Health Services team when you volunteer at the local chapter and join the disaster services system. A student will come to the health service activity as a student caregiver, entering the local chapter as what we call a spontaneous volunteer. And once the student completes all the training and screening requirements, such as a background check, you can immediately start working as a Red Cross community volunteer. Just so you understand, student caregivers are not deployable outside of your state's region. So when, for instance, you would join in your local chapter, you would be able to help in your local community as long as you're a student. Once you complete your professional license, whether it's an RN or a nurse practitioner or a physician license, then you are become a deployable asset within the Red Cross disaster response system. Let's talk about Red Cross shelters. In November of 2010, FEMA released a guidance for planning for integration of functional needs support services in general population shelter. And this document really provided planning guidance to help incorporate into the existing shelter plans and to assist state emergency managers and shelter managers to really meet the access and functional needs in a general population shelter. FEMA's guidance was to clarify steps that should be taken in order to plan for and accommodate the whole of the community into a general population shelter. These new legal obligations were not created through this guidance. However, the existing legal rights such as accessibility and non-discrimination and accommodation of persons with disabilities is emphasized. So in this model, there are two types of shelters. There's a general population shelter, which is an organized temporary accommodation for persons displaced by an incident or disaster. It's also referred by some as a congregate or an emergency shelter. Individuals with access and functional needs will have their needs assessed and met in the shelter, given that they do not require sustained or ongoing medical supervision. These are the shelters that Red Cross often organizes and partners in, although other community entities can run these types of shelters as well. The second type of shelter that you may have heard about or might be exposed to in your professional career is called a medical needs shelter. And this is a shelter serving individuals who require sustained assistance or supervision for medical needs, but may or may not have an acute condition requiring hospitalization. So many people live at home with multiple chronic conditions, but they don't really need sustained assistance or supervision for medical needs. So those people can be in a general shelter, but if you have a need for intense supervision, you may need to be in a medical needs shelter. The American Red Cross does not manage medical needs shelters, but sometimes a medical needs shelter is co-located within a general population shelter. In most states, the medical needs shelters are a responsibility of the public health system, although in some states, hospital systems also take that role. So this course, as you are involved in part one, is a two-part course. This first part is the online, but the second part will be a live tabletop in your classroom where we will do case studies and put together some of the information you're learning today. In addition to learning about public health principles, you will gain some situational awareness on functioning as a disaster health worker in a shelter under the supervision of a Red Cross RN. When you are deployed with us, you will be representing the Red Cross, even if you're a just-in-time volunteer. And so you need to know to each individual with whom you come into contact, you are the Red Cross. That means your conduct would need to meet the standards of an American Red Cross Code of Conduct. For instance, when you're working for the Red Cross Disaster Services, you're going to have a T-shirt or a vest, you'll have a Red Cross name badge, and it's a organization that has a lot of pride and history of being good. So it's actually a very good fit for nursing, but it's just something to remember if you should take on this decision. However, it's really important that you have personal preparedness. You might be better prepared to help in your community if you have your own preparedness plan. So I encourage you to pause the recording for a moment, stop and take a minute, and think about what be some must-haves in your personal preparedness for you or your family or in your workplace. Make a list of the top 5 items you would include in your go bag. After you've made your list, press play, and we'll continue with the recording. So what is the role of disaster health services? What do we do as part of the Red Cross team? In most disasters, such as hurricanes, floods, or wildfires, only a small percent of those affected are hospitalized. Most of the public, while displaced, traumatized, or otherwise impacted, remain in the community or in a shelter. The American Red Cross Disaster Health Services role is to meet the disaster-related or exacerbated health needs of that population. Some examples of interventions that we might participate in: an individual health assessment as persons walk into the shelter might result in a triage decision or a need for a referral to a higher level of care. A population assessment of a group of shelter residents might find a need for a public health referral due to exposure to communicable disease. Or special measures may need to be considered if there are not enough sinks for people to wash their hands. The focus of Red Cross Disaster Health Service workers is to work with clients to meet health-related needs. This means providing care and comfort to affected individuals as well as assisting them with replacement of essential healthcare items such as prescription medications, eyeglasses, or other equipment that may be lost as a result of the disaster. When you're working in a congregate environment, such as a general population shelter, the worker must also be aware of the potential for public health concerns and take appropriate measures when necessary to prevent them. It is important for the continuity of the client's healthcare needs that the needs are coordinated with community-based health and medical resources whenever possible. Referring clients to the resources they would ordinarily use is to their benefit, but during a disaster incident, creative measures may need to be taken for client advocacy and referral. It's rare, but in some instances, disaster health services may supplement the existing service delivery systems. Most of the time, the infrastructure for the healthcare delivery system is really not totally destroyed, and so we are supplementing it a little bit. But when there's a lot of hospitals down or clinics down, Red Cross provides additional care for the general population. Some examples of an extreme case might be a global pandemic, a catastrophic event like a major earthquake. In those cases, there might be enough impact on the healthcare delivery system that we would really become a more active partner with local public health departments, medical reserve corps units, and other local healthcare systems to support the healthcare of that community. So what do you need to be a health services worker? What are the competencies for nursing and medical care providers in our and expectations, really, for practitioners in our fields? I'm sure you've heard this many times in your curriculum already, but critical thinking is key. In disaster sheltering, the population is always displaced, maybe confused, angry, sleep-deprived, separated from significant family support, as well as being ill or injured. As a healthcare professional, thinking in a broad context is required. I look at it as if it's a three-dimensional video game, because you're thinking not just of the individual, but you're thinking of the family and you're thinking of the community as a context. Using clinical judgment and decision-making skills in assessing the client for appropriate and timely and individual care needs is of utmost importance. You're doing assessment in this situation. Again, the context can impact the interpretation of findings on an assessment. So making clinical judgments based on the assessment of the individual, their families, and the surrounding environment is key. You will need to bring your technical skills, just as in any other practice setting, the skills of look, listen, touch, blood pressure, lung sounds, those things will need to be brought to the table. Having a sense of illness and disease management is key as well. Congregate care living requires a close eye to management of illness and early recognition of potentially contagious disease. Surveillance is an important part of shelter work. You will be recording and taking appropriate action in collaboration with the local Red Cross chapter, public health department, and other partners when you're monitoring illnesses in the population. And later in this presentation, we will talk about surveillance a little more. You need to have capability of using information and healthcare technologies. However, know that not every shelter will have internet access. Often in disasters, some of these things are not immediately available. But knowing how to use technology and where to look for information and how to use your resources will be a valuable asset that you can bring to these responses. And as we know, nursing is known as one of the most ethically responsible professions, and the Red Cross has an international reputation for humane work with integrity. In nursing and medicine, you're already expected to have these values and to demonstrate these values. So it's just something we like to reassert, in particular, the awareness of confidentiality. We have the same principles in Red Cross around confidentiality. What about our commitments to clients for healthcare services? I won't read this entire list. I'll leave that for you to review. But there are a couple things that are critical and integral to the core values of the American Red Cross Disaster Health Services. As I mentioned on the last slide, confidentiality is crucial, and in the setting of a congregate care living, it can be much, much more difficult. So what's pretty easy to do on an acute care unit, because you go back to the nurse's station and have a chat or pull into a private room, there's often times in a congregate living situation where there is no private room. So you have to be extra attentive to discretion and careful communications. It's much more difficult to keep private care private in the fishbowl of a disaster general population shelter. Obviously, you're going to be working as a team. We do have to document. I'll talk a little bit later about documentation. But the last one there about using resources wisely is an awareness you would need to bring that would be different from other work settings. The American Red Cross is funded primarily by donations from the American people. Resource management is critical. Whether we are dispensing glasses or helping to pay for medications, we have an obligation to assure that the need is valid and that other resources, such as private insurance, are considered first. This is disaster response, though, and the needs of the client must be respectfully and quickly met to enable the best care and the best chance for resilience and recovery for our clients. So you may wonder, what kind of things are you likely to see in a shelter? The first level is individual illness and injury, things that are a sudden onset. When disaster strikes, minor injuries and illnesses often take a back seat to the immediacy of the need to evacuate, the desire to seek help for others, and to the overwhelming needs of the moment. So in the general population shelters, we might see client injuries. The most often that we see are bone, muscle, and joint injuries due to strains during evacuation or from huddling in the basement or lifting things they might not have ordinarily even tried to lift, even tree limbs off the car. We see respiratory distress. Often there'll be stress-induced asthma or reactive airway disease, in particular from smoke exposure during wildfires. We often see lacerations and puncture wounds from cleaning up after tornadoes, moving debris, after floods, that sort of thing. You might see exposure because of extreme weather conditions. Many times people evacuate into extremes of heat or rain or blizzard or ice storms. Rain often follows tornadoes, leaving people outside in the rain, often in the springtime when it is much colder than people realize. Rashes are common, especially during floods, because walking through flood waters is a very toxic stew. So you want to be aware of that. And we will also see burns. These can be chemical burns from contaminated water, thermal burns from trying to stay in your house during a wildfire, and electrical burns from exposure to downed wires. In the next slide, we talk about what other things you might be seeing. Think about the training you already have had in your curriculum on stress-related symptoms. In a disaster shelter, these same things can occur. You may have stress-related symptoms that are changes in vital signs, GI upsets, headaches. Labor can begin earlier than expected. I think one of the key bullets on this slide is that the presenting symptoms may vary. So you may have in your mind sort of a textbook presentation of how a particular situation might reveal itself, and in the shelter and disaster environment, they don't show up with the same symptoms they are quote-unquote supposed to for that condition, so it can be confusing. So I want to move us into some case studies. When you're doing rounds in the shelter, the health services nurse discovers that there are 5 women in the shelter who are greater than 32 weeks pregnant, including one client who is at 38 weeks, a gravida 5, para 4. The closest hospital is no longer taking OB clients, and the nearest next delivery option is greater than 2 hours because of disaster-related obstacles. Let's go to the next slide. So for this mini case number 1, pause the recording and take a minute to consider this question. What will you be considering for care of this client and her family? When you're done thinking it through or writing some notes to yourself, press play to continue the recording. Now that you have written your answers down or made some thoughts about it, here are some of the answers that we came up with for this situation. One of the things your health services team might be planning for this gravida 5, para 4 client is that what if you need to move her, and what are you going to do if you need to deliver locally, or would you even need to deliver in the shelter? The second thing you might be thinking is maybe we need to make arrangements with this client and her family to either move her to a shelter that is closer to the OB hospital that's 2 hours away, or perhaps find some living circumstances for her to be within range of the delivery hospital. There are no right answers to this question, but those are a couple answers that we came up with in our work. Let's go to the next slide and look at a mini case study number 2. And again, I invite you to pause the recording and take a minute to review this case, read the entire slide, think about what your concerns would be related to this circumstance, what nursing concerns you have about this couple, and then I'd like you to list 4 things that you would be considering. When you're done with your list, you can press play and go to the next slide. Here are some potential answers to the case that you just read about a couple in the shelter who've been very, very somnolent for many days. There are several possible concerns for this couple, including but not limited to these 6 considerations. They are at risk for depression. They may be overwhelmed. They may be exhausted. But you also need to think, they could be at risk for pneumonia from laying around too much. That's also a risk for blood clots from not moving around, and certainly for dehydration, for not eating and drinking adequately. Just some things to think about. All right, let's look at some other client needs. Just like stress-related symptoms, stress on top of chronic illnesses can be compounded. So you may find that the disaster events make an aggravation of chronic health conditions such as hypertension, cardiac, respiratory, GI, diabetes, and other. You also need to think about this risk in the volunteers, especially local volunteers, because it is their community and their families and neighbors. So oftentimes the local volunteers will have been working day and night, not sleeping, with poor nutrition and missing their regular medications. With regard to chronic health conditions being aggravated by disaster, I have 3 real-life stories. There was a large Katrina shelter in Louisiana and a local volunteer, and when I arrived at that shelter, it was the 4th day since the hurricane had hit. His blood pressure was 240 over 130, and he was in a hypertensive crisis and was taken by ambulance to the emergency department. He'd not been sleeping well, he'd been working around the clock, and he had not been taking his daily blood pressure medications. So sometimes when you arrive, you may feel like you've waited too long because it's 2 or 3 days since the disaster and you finally got your life together and you showed up at the Red Cross and said, I'd like to help. One group you might want to be thinking about as you arrive at your assignment setting is, what about the people who've been there for the last 3 days trying to hold on till more help arrived? Another thing to think about is that in some areas of the country, asthma is more prevalent than in others. So high heat, high humidity, and dehydration, plus the stressors of harder work during recovery and the mental stress of the impact can exacerbate asthma or increase the frequency of distress. Working in mold can stress those with underlying respiratory disease. In congregate care settings, based on community resources, there can also be fewer food choices for managing diabetes and other needs of meal planning. Oftentimes in the disaster response, especially in the early days until the food system is organized, there can be high carbohydrate meals, few fresh fruits and vegetables. But diabetic clients need to be extra vigilant because just the stress alone can alter their blood sugars. Blood sugars can drop out faster, they can run too high because of food choices. So one of our roles in disaster health services is to advocate for our clients to obtain proper nutritional support. And allergies to foods and latex can be very insidious. We invite our clients with food allergies to self-identify to the food service staff, but sometimes, again, in the busyness of the environment, people aren't remembering that they have food allergies. So what do health service workers do? We show you the scope of practice of the American Red Cross Disaster Health Services worker. So we do screening and assessment to meet needs. We care for disaster-related or aggravated injuries or illnesses. We work in our settings now on larger deployments. We have a disability integration specialist, and we often work with them to assist clients who need replacement of durable medical equipment, personal care assistance, health maintenance, and sometimes we need to replace consumable medical supplies like catheters and similar things, wound supplies. We work providing casework for disaster health-related needs. We have the capability to replace some immediate need prescriptions and some essential things such as eyeglasses. And we also do a lot of referrals to community health agencies. One of the things that Red Cross is able to bring to the table that most other organizations do not have is we have a budget per person for clients who need support for recovery. So there are Red Cross donated money specifically set aside to meet health and mental health needs in the community post-disaster incident or emergency response, and this can be very valuable. And on the next slide, we also do some work with durable medical equipment such as wheelchairs, walkers, toilet risers. Again, this is a situation where we work with our disability integration specialists on behalf of persons with disabilities and persons with access and functional needs for durable medical equipment and recovery support. One of the key pieces of this, and you've probably noticed that I mentioned this a couple of times, is we have to use other resources first because all the dollars for disaster for Red Cross are donated dollars. We aren't part of a government program that gets funding. So we really need to be resourceful and vigilant to make sure we've checked all the other ways that something might get paid for, whether it's a pharmacy system or perhaps a local business who will donate a nebulizer to the disaster, those kind of things. We want to check that out ahead of time. Do they have insurance before we use donated dollars? So if you're involved in a client interview, let's go to the next slide and talk about that. So if you were being asked at the shelter, you're helping a family and they've lost some things, you might wonder, well, what kind of questions do you need to ask if you're having to replace something? And these are a list of the kind of questions that you might be considering to kind of get at the answer. And this approach is not so different from how a public health nurse might work with a client in the community to sort out available community resources that they have for their particular situation, which will then help the nurse and the client determine what is the referral plan. So what happened to the equipment? Is it disaster related? Do they need some help? Do we have third-party coverage? Who is your normal provider? Those kind of things can help you work with the client to figure out how we get this fixed. So you may be wondering who are Red Cross clients. And truly all members of the affected community, anybody, disasters do not discriminate. So that might include non-English speaking, persons with disabilities, clients who come with or without their caregivers. It can be affluent communities and culturally diverse communities. And the bullet at the end there is just a reminder that we also take care of each other. So when we're on a job, there may be other Red Cross volunteers who get sick or injured or ill, who need some support from health services, who broke their glasses, that kind of thing, and we help our coworkers as well. In the next slide, we'll talk about where our health service workers are. While this course is focused primarily on sheltering, there are many other assignment settings that Red Cross nurses get the opportunity to experience. If students go on to a local Red Cross chapter to volunteer once you're licensed, the scope of practice settings is broad. We work on integrated care and condolence teams. This is a model to coordinate support and services for families of the deceased or survivors that have been hospitalized and their families. This is an integrated approach which is designed to meet the individual's emergency assistance needs with support and services provided by multiple activities at the same time. So we work as a team with caseworkers, health workers, mental health workers, and a spiritual care. Sometimes Red Cross does emergency aid stations. This takes on a different function for distribution of supplies. And an emergency aid station is not a first aid delivery center. It's really a resource site where families can sometimes they're even drive-through, and a family can get a cleanup kit or just some how-to information. But we really like to station a nurse and sometimes a medical health professional there, and a mental health professional to just kind of check in. It's a great way to sort of take the temperature of the community to figure out how are people doing from the health and the mental health perspective. We also do outreach, community, and home visits. Depending on the type of disaster, health services workers might join an outreach team that goes door to door, offering information, or follow behind an emergency response vehicle that's serving meals. We might follow behind them in a car, and they get their lunch, and then the health service people come by and say, so how are you doing? Do you have all your medications? And so kind of work as a team with our food or bulk distribution delivery partners. You might have a home visit, which is very common in public health. We might be going to a client's home to conduct a specific needs assessment. Usually this is for a health or mental health need. An example of a home visit might be assessing a client within their home for replacement of an assisted device, or maybe a medically driven home repair related to the disaster, such as rebuilding a wheelchair ramp or something like that. Our other settings include an emergency operations center liaison. This is an interesting position. It's a link between the field operations, the organizational leadership, and the community's incident command structure. A health emergency operations center liaison would represent the healthcare needs of the community served by the American Red Cross. So, for example, during an H1N1 flu outbreak, there were multiple health and medical emergency operations centers set up around the nation, and Red Cross often had a licensed health provider as a liaison in those settings. We are a federally designated response organization with the National Transportation Safety Board. We are part of their Federal Family Assistance Plan for Aviation Disasters. And the American Red Cross comes and helps with family assistance centers. We do mental health support. We do lots of partnership with the aviation and transportation disasters. And that can be air, train, bus, or even sometimes extensive multi-vehicular accidents. And finally, we do repatriation. This is a multi-specialty team that includes, just like the integrated care and condolence teams, health services, disaster mental health, client casework, and spiritual care. In this case, this team works very closely with key governmental officials to assist families in the return of their loved ones from the site of a disaster occurring outside the country. One example is our response to the Haiti earthquake in 2010, where the American Red Cross aided in the repatriation of the deceased American citizens from that earthquake. Okay, let's move on to sheltering, the core of our discussion. Now, I must say that this photo does not represent the typical shelter in a disaster. Most often, our shelters are smaller churches or high schools. They are not the Astrodomes that are often seen, is the image most people see in the media. And even so, even in a church or a high school, you could imagine that privacy is rare and communicable disease is a risk. We may need to advocate as health service workers for bathrooms, hand-washing facilities, and other essentials in the sheltering environment when those things are limited. The Red Cross has a shelter survey tool which helps us look ahead of time for such things as AEDs, ramps, accessible bathrooms, and other reasonable modifications that might be needed. Typically, the American Red Cross does not own the facilities used as a shelter, but we do have shelter agreements with the owners, which may include reasonable modifications when used for disaster. The Red Cross makes every effort in all of its sheltering sites to meet the Americans with Disabilities Act guidelines and to be fully accessible. We are always in communication with the local public health department. Also, one branch of a public health department or health system is the environmental health or sanitarians. The American Red Cross is responsible for safe food handling for the public, but the public health department has general oversight for food safety in their community. That arm of the public health that is responsible for disease prevention and health promotion in the affected community will also want to be kept in the loop with daily surveillance statistics. In order to do surveillance, they may have us use a local form, there may be a state surveillance form, or we may be using the Red Cross version, but all of us are keeping an eye on the frequency of presentation of some symptoms crucial to stay ahead of an outbreak. If you downloaded the forms I mentioned to you earlier, the aggregate morbidity form is the surveillance form used by the American Red Cross. This is a neighborhood of tents and other structures in Haiti after the earthquake of 2010. I'm going to ask you to pause this recording and take a minute to consider what kind of health concerns come to mind in this kind of recovery sheltering versus buildings such as a school or church. So write down a couple of things while you're on pause, and when you're done with your answers, let's move to the next slide. So some possible answers, and there are no right or wrong, but some things to think about is a tent only provides minimal protection from the environment. So it might be okay in a tropical setting such as Haiti, but in other parts of the country where the only resource is going to be tents, we might have problems with temperatures, with incoming storms, with safety for infants and children and seniors, for example. Rain and mud, they impact mobility restricted clients from access to restrooms. So if you have to move your wheelchair through 6 inches of mud to get to the porta potties, you probably aren't going to get there. So that could be a challenge. Tents can be confining, so you can get upper respiratory infections from cooking in tents when there's a lot of people living in the tent. Often there are no floors in the tent. And accessibility can be a concern for individuals with functional limitations, getting up and down off of cots or up and down off the floor. So sheltering is not always, a 5-star hotel. Let's go to the next slide. This is a partial list of considerations for disaster health services, but there may be others. Again, there's no right answer, but I ask you to pause the recording and take a minute and think about, okay, well, we might be present at registration. We might be there in the dormitory and discussing and working with people who need help in the dormitory. We're thinking about communicable disease management, but what other things from your study in school and your development as a nursing student and a medical student come to mind that you might want to be thinking about while you are on duty in this environment? Again, there is no right or wrong answer, but when you're done, press play and go to the next slide. While you're in the shelter, part of your scope of practice will be assisting with identifying client needs. And in our system, we believe it begins at registration. And the registration desk can be a busy place. It may feel awkward or inappropriate to ask what may be considered relatively private questions. So we want to limit that exposure and that vulnerability while still giving clients an immediate opportunity to let us know of their needs. Privacy is often limited to non-existent at the registration area, and some clients are not sure what they will need while at their shelter as they are recently displaced. They've never been in a shelter, they're worried about their family, their home, their job, their future, and really may not at this time be able to even recall such things. So our job is to provide multiple opportunities for clients to identify or share their support needs over time. So our system starts out with what we call two observations and 2 questions. The observations presume that first, if you've discovered by introductions that no one in the family speaks English or is deaf or hard of hearing, the first thing you'll need to do is delay the registration and work with the shelter manager to assure that you have the appropriate translator or interpreter support made available. So the first observation is, does the client or family member appear to be in need of immediate medical attention, appear to be too overwhelmed or agitated to complete registration, or is a threat to themselves or others? Sometimes even English as a second language may be the cause of the client appearing to be overwhelmed. When people are traumatized, they have less ability to use a second language. So if the person is too upset, then you need to stop the registration and help that person because we can do the registration later. The second observation is if the client has a service animal, uses a wheelchair or a walker, or demonstrates any other circumstance where it appears they may need help in the shelter, to acknowledge the potential need and offer assistance. So you don't have to wait for the client to mention it because the client who's in a wheelchair knows that they're in a wheelchair. The client who has a service animal knows that. So it's perfectly appropriate and polite to say, for instance, I see you have a service animal. Would you like us to get some dormitory staff to assist you with finding the best place so that you can toilet your service animal at night and in the morning? And that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to say. The 2 questions, let's go to that, are also very straightforward and simple. We ask these questions because people really may not know what they need. They've never been here before. They may be very concerned about other things. So we ask, is there anything you or a member of your family needs right now to stay healthy in the shelter? We did research with this question and found that many people say no. And so we want to give a different framework for that question. We know that when people have more concrete time frames, they have a little bit better ability to focus. So we say, if they say no to the first question, we reframe the question and say, how about, is there anything you need in the next 6 to 8 hours? Because sometimes the smaller, more manageable time frame can trigger a reminder of something they might need later in the day, a medication, formula for the baby, something like that. The second question is actually another way of asking the first one. Is there anything they are concerned about? Because really it doesn't matter what I'm concerned about, what I'm trying to figure out. What matters is what they are concerned about. What are their concerns that are consuming them? So in asking this, we may learn of support needs that we can assist with. To fully identify client needs, we need systems that intentionally create multiple opportunities for clients to meet with persons who are thinking about their needs and a framework to approach that. And that is really the COT-to-COT methodology, which we're going to talk about next. We're going to briefly discuss triage, and then we're going to talk about the CMIST framework. So let's first take a brief step back to what is triage. In Red Cross, we really don't use the language of triage. I know I've said it a couple of times, but we really, in our world, triage is a term that's used in mass casualty events and in emergency departments to sort clients by need and resources. And in an American Red Cross shelter, which really is a community care setting, our work is more prioritization and sorting by urgent needs. So you may need to prioritize who needs care first or who needs a referral to the emergency room or to a clinic. If you have a shelter that opens before landfall, such as you're living in hurricane area or they know the flood is coming and they're evacuating people ahead of a flood, you may have different levels of urgency because the disaster hasn't hit yet, but you still will need to do some prioritization. And if you haven't discussed triage yet in your curriculum, this is a Wikipedia link to triage that gives you some of their principles. Okay, let's talk about CMIST. CMIST is an acronym that describes a system to help identify access and functional needs of clients in shelters. And if you downloaded this form, as I mentioned earlier, I recommend you pull it out because it'll make a lot more sense. The sections on the slides I'm going to show you have less information on them than the actual form that you can actually look at. I want to talk, I know I've mentioned this several times about access and functional needs, and that may not be common terminology in your curriculum. You've learned about activities of daily living, and you talk about ADLs, but what we have learned in the disaster world is that a medical model that's diagnosis-based does not work because it doesn't really tell you what a functional support need for a client is. You can't always tie the name of a diagnosis to what the client needs. Activities of daily living are great, you know, bathing, toileting, eating, dressing, but it's just not a big enough tent to cover the things that we cope with in disaster sheltering. So we use access and function under this structure of CMIST to try and give ourselves language to be sure that we're assessing clients across a broader range of potential needs. So let's just spend a little bit of time on each section. So communication, you can tell right away by looking at this. This is not an interview tool. This is a way to think about needs and support. So on the format, the need is on the left and some possibilities for action or support are on the right. Communication is to remind us of the various ways people may need to support to communicate. So on the left, you have access to auxiliary services or devices or equipment. And on the right, some ideas of the things you might want to think about in order to support. So for instance, services, you need access to supportive services. That might include written materials, alternative formats, visual announcements, language or oral interpreters, or even just writing equipment, such as papers and pen. Auxiliary devices might include TTY or TDD or cell phone or texting capability, and auxiliary communication equipment might be batteries for a hearing aid, or it might be visual where they need replacement of their eyeglasses. So this is a kind of a little different way of thinking. It's not like an interview or a triage in an emergency room. It's really thinking more comprehensively about the ways a person's life is impacted to get through daily life. Again, this slide has much less on it than the entire form, but it does help stimulate your thoughts as you're visiting with your clients in the shelter about acquisition of consumable medical supplies, pharmacy needs. You might want to talk about special diets. Does someone need gluten-free or peanut-free or kosher or low-sugar food and beverages? You might be looking at medications, wound management, diabetes, bowel or bladder care, assistance with medical care that's normally given in the home, like they might be on oxygen at home, or might have to do self-catheterization. You want to think about your pregnant women, nursing mothers and infants, and make sure you have the support they need to continue their care. You might want to think about quiet areas. You may need a more quiet area for elderly or psychiatric situations or autistic clients or infant care, or you might even have clients at the shelter who are working the night shift. They're still able to go to work, but they don't have any place to live. So you might be helping them figure out how are you going to have day sleepers. You might want to think about the temperature for people who cannot regulate their body temperatures. In one situation I was in, we had a very large shelter in the south, and it was 94 degrees outside and about 90% humidity. It was awful. So we had to have the building air conditioned. Well, when you have a huge building air conditioned with, 2,000 people in it, the air conditioner has to run all the time. And it got so cold at night that our clients needed wool blankets. And I would never have thought I would need to order a truckload of wool blankets in Louisiana in September, but that's the kind of thing that you have to think kind of outside the box. There's a whole generation of people now who got polio in the 1950s who now have post-polio syndrome, and they cannot regulate their body temperature as part of this post-polio syndrome. So another group of people that might not normally be on your radar. And kind of omnipresent in everything we do, we need to be providing psychological first aid and mental health care, because anxiety and stress management, and there may be situations that require even a referral to our partners' disaster mental health. In our model of CMIS, the I is about independence. So this is where we really focus on, do you have all the equipment that you normally need for mobility? Wheelchairs, walkers, canes, and crutches, but it also might be things for bathing and toileting, like a raised toilet seat or grab bars or a shower handle or a bath bench. We need to provide accessible cots, so we might have people that can't sit on the low cot, but if we get a universal cot that's made to sit up a little higher, they can sit on it. We might need to help support power sources for battery-powered assistive devices, including chairs that need charging, or some people use their iPad for their communication device. We need to provide bariatric accommodation and appropriate weight cots, care for service animals, providing food supplies and water maybe for infants, and infant food and diapers. So there's quite a few things that, even though you don't think about an infant being independent, part of what keeps that family unit independent is if the things they need to care for their infant are made available. The S in CMIST is for services, support, and self-determination. And this is a general observation and assistance with non-medical activities of daily living, such as grooming and eating, bathing, toileting, dressing, undressing, walking, etc. But we also may need some adult or child personal assistive services. And our first choice is look to see if you can identify a family member or a friend who's a caregiver. Second tier, we might see if we can find a qualified shelter volunteer to provide personal assistance services. That could include nursing students or medical students. We also have a training program in Red Cross, a caregiver course where we've trained other Red Cross volunteers to help with walking and dressing and transporting. Or we may need to go outside of our unit and contact a local agency to provide personal assistance services. This can be, again, nursing students, home health care aides, other volunteer partners, such as Medical Reserve Corps or FAST teams or search teams. One thing that we need to think about with caregiving is that we need to think about the adult caregivers may themselves be overwhelmed by the disaster and actually need more support than usual. So in a hospital, we know how that setup is. In a shelter, we might be inclined to think, oh, good, this elderly man's wife is with him, he's got his caregiver, good to go, don't even have to think about it again, without really understanding that caregiver has to also do all of the recovery from the disaster and all the navigation around recovery, as well as be the home caregiver. So we need to be leaning forward as a humanitarian organization to look at, is there some way people might need more help? Our clients are the ones with the best knowledge of what they need for their care. So we really support an awareness of the ethic of self-determination for advocacy of adults in all aspects of their care. But you also might want to be aware that sometimes the delivery systems will tell people they have to go to a medical or special needs shelter, and people have a right of determination to go where they want to go. So that's just something to be aware of, because you might be in a position in your personal life where you are helping advise in this kind of situation. And finally, the T and CMIST is transportation. So we have it separated on this form as transportation to a designated facility for medical care or treatment, and coordination of accessible shelter vehicles and drivers, or contacting a local transit service. And we have it separated out for non-medical appointments, for coordination with the shelter manager or working with the local community. But from my perspective, it really doesn't matter why a client needs to leave the shelter. We need to work together as a team to make sure transportation is available. And transportation, along with communication, is probably the most common thing that goes bad in a disaster. So the wind blows through and most of the clients' cars have trees on them and they can't drive them. Or the flood comes through Texas and all of the cars, I think some huge percentage of the cars in either Texas or Baton Rouge couldn't be driven because they had flooded. So transportation can go just literally overnight to a major part of the disaster response. So I encourage health services to work very closely with the shelter manager and coordinate transportation, because you need to know if you're going to have to make dialysis runs, if you need to go to pharmacies to pick up medications, to make appointments. And so we really keep all that, health services and the shelter manager working closely together. The last part of the CMIST form is the follow-through. And this is a great addition to our documentation system, because we really needed a way to document the action items, and that's why the CMIST is presented under health services. We expect all of our dormitory staff and shelter staff to understand the principles of CMIST, but we know that when it comes right down to it, nurses are the ones who have an ethic and a professional habit of documenting. So that's why the documentation is on this form. So here we can document the action items, who was contacted, when they were contacted, and what was the follow-up or resolution of the request for support or commitment. We can put, medical supply company will call back Tuesday, and the nurses on duty can say, wait a minute, it's Wednesday, we were supposed to have that yesterday, and here's the name, and here's the phone number, let's call them back. So we can really act on these things. And that really makes a better way of kind of closing the loop for our clients who are already kind of living in a sense of chaos. We also sign it and date it. This form is kept with Disaster Health Services, and it is kept privacy protected. So what is the nursing care model for the structure for CMIST? In the next slide, we talk about cot to cot. And in cot to cot, we're really going to proceed with a systematic plan to meet each family within a reasonable time frame. And this time frame is 6 to 8 hours. So we really want to make rounds. Cot to cot is a metaphor for making rounds. We want to do it right away, but truthfully, in the chaos of opening a shelter, it may take up to 24 hours. If you downloaded this sheet, you can pull it out. This cot-to-cot methodology has been tested in several disasters, and its strength is in relationship building with clients. And if you have studied in public health, you know that relationship building is a core tenet of the cornerstones of nursing. So as disaster health and mental health services volunteers, we circulate in the shelter every day. Clients come to know who we are and really build trust relationships with us. Also, we found that over those same days, the initial stressors of evacuation recede, and the clients become more aware of their personal mobility, their health, and other support needs they have not been able to tend to. If you're setting this up in a larger shelter, you may want to consider a strategy of identifying neighborhoods within the shelter so that you can assign the same staff to the same places every day, so that if you have a large shelter with 2,000 people, you might have 20 neighborhoods of 100 in each neighborhood and a nurse in each neighborhood, so that that nurse gets to go back to the same neighborhood every day. Some examples of how this works. We had several clients who evacuated after a tornado who presented to the health services area on the fourth day after the tornado with eye pain. And they all had dirt in their eyes from the tornado, but because they were so distracted and releasing so many endorphins because of that anxiety, they weren't even aware they had pain for 3 or 4 days. In another setting, again, this cot-to-cot, reviewing clients every day. We had a senior citizen with an oxygen concentrator that had been left in her car in the parking lot of the shelter for 3 days because she didn't want to bother anyone. And it was only when the health services staff was making daily rounds and saying, you know, I don't think your color looks so good, she finally felt like she could mention that she normally uses oxygen and has a concentrator. We had a client who had a personal care attendant at his home, but because of the nature of the evacuation, the care attendant did not evacuate because they were hired by another company and they couldn't go across county lines to work, so they did not evacuate to the same county he did, and he had no care. But he did not want to ask for such intimate care as changing his Depends at the registration desk. So it was only when the health services staff made daily rounds and got to know him, he was able to confide his intimate needs. So let's take a quick look at the cot-to-cot method. It's a one-sheet page, so this is just the top of the page, and it just gives you another way to think about how it works. So at the top here of this page kind of is all the stuff we've been talking about. There's a tornado, people get displaced, they come to a shelter, and you're doing real-time population assessment with 2 observations and 2 questions. Then you're doing urgent medical needs referral if people need to go to another place or they need to be referred to someone on site. You're trying to take care of the needs that you can do in the first 6 hours. And then if you go to the next page, or the bottom of the page, you'll see that cot-to-cot is really making rounds. You're going around daily. Sometimes you might be going twice a day. And yes, you're doing activities of daily living and support for bathing and eating and moving around the shelter, but you're also looking at durable medical equipment, supplies, psychological first aid. And in pretty much every shelter, we also have a health desk. So we have a place where people can select to come for acute care or acute illnesses. My baby has a fever. I need some children's ibuprofen. I need to replace my medications. I need a referral. I'm going to need a ride to get to dialysis. As with all things public health, we're doing surveillance, education, counseling, and collaboration and advocacy. In the American Red Cross, we use an RN-led model of care with the scope of practice of a registered nurse in a community setting. Next slide, let's go back to a case study. So you might want to pause the slide while you read it and take a look. A shelter has opened in a community that's having a flood, and 80% of the homes and businesses are affected, and you're working at the registration desk when you meet Mr. Jones. A single male who lives independently in the community enters the shelter, uses a wheelchair for mobility, and has great difficulty hearing. And as you interview him, you learn he has to catheterize himself to empty his bladder and requires dialysis twice a week. Okay, so you think through Mr. Jones, think about the shelter environment, and let's go to the next slide and press pause again. And I want you to take a minute and think about the answers to these questions. Okay, there's no really set of right or wrong answers. This is really an opportunity for you to brainstorm the case. And when you're done thinking, you can push play for some possible answers. So the possible answers are your immediate concerns may be helping him maintain his independence, protecting privacy, maintaining asepsis, transportation to dialysis, dietary restrictions, and care of his shunt. His risk factors are, or could be, age, sedentary lifestyle, chronicity of catheterization, kidney function, and potential damage to his shunt. His equipment needs may include replacement catheters, equipment, and space to store his supplies for self-catheterization and port care supplies. He does have transportation needs. And can he be safely accommodated? This is probably the trickiest question in the case because, though, our acute care background can lead us to think, boy, it sounds like he needs to go to the hospital. But Mr. Jones came from home, and this is how Mr. Jones lives at home. And this is a community shelter. So the answer is yes, we can accommodate him in this shelter, but we're going to have to do some support for him to be able to stay here. Okay, let's go to the next slide and apply the CMIST model to Mr. Jones and see how the CMIST model can help us assess him as well. So under communication, he is hard of hearing. Under medical, maintaining health, his health needs include catheterization. But does he also have perhaps behavioral health risk factors? He may. Under independence, what is he going to need to remain independent? Does he need a caregiver? Maybe in this setting, even though he doesn't need one at home, he might need one in the setting of the shelter. He might need some support. And also for mobility. Supervision, self-determination, will he be able to self-cath in this setting? Is there a space where he can go for privacy, where he can lay out all the supplies and be left alone 4 or 5 times a day in order to do his care? And finally, the T for transportation, how will he get to dialysis? So you can see that this goes beyond medical diagnosis and beyond activities of daily living, and goes into some functional tasks and support for Mr. Jones in the shelter environment. There are many behavioral health conditions that can be supported in a Red Cross shelter. Autism, anxiety, developmental disabilities, other mental health conditions that are under pharmaceutical support. And in American Red Cross disaster settings, there are disaster mental health professionals. But we may have clients whose mental health needs require a higher level of care and who may need to be referred to these professionals or outside the system. So what are some behavioral health conditions that might require a higher level of care? These could include clients with serious symptoms, so acute anxiety or severe depression, or clients who are disruptive to other residents. You may have a client who makes a disclosure of a psychiatric condition or a past experience that would make staying in the shelter unsustainable. You may have clients who are experiencing significant distress due to the shelter environment, even after accommodations have been made. And we do have rules in Red Cross shelters that illegal drugs or alcohol are not allowed in the shelter, and if there are people who persist in using illegal drugs and alcohol, they may also need to be referred to a housing outside of the shelter environment. In the next slide, let's talk about documentation, because as you know from your professional practice, we always have to document. So this is a list of some of the forms you might we'll either discuss them in the classroom exercise portion of the course, but just to let you know, we do have a client health record, and this is a confidential client record that is maintained and kept locked up, and we keep them locked at the chapter after the disaster, along with that CMIST job guide that we mentioned earlier that's also kept with health services. The initial intake and assessment tool, that's the 2 observations and 2 questions, that's part of shelter registration. So we do not keep that form. But oftentimes we are part of the initial intake screening process. We sometimes sit at the registration desk. I talked to you earlier about the aggregate morbidity and surveillance form, and we do a tally on that form. I'll show you that form in a minute. I did not provide you a copy of it here, but you can get it off the website of Release of Confidential Information. So just like in your practice in public health or acute care, there are times when our clients need to sign a form that gives us permission to talk to their provider. And again, I talked to you about the CMIST job guide earlier. Let's take a little look at surveillance. So what is surveillance? You've probably discussed this in your class. It's a way to assure early identification of illness or outbreaks. It's a process to capture illness and injury patterns over longer time. So there's a short-term piece and now a longer term. So in our setting, we can look at surveillance reports, say for instance, of floods and see are there any particular patterns of illness that we often see during floods versus wildfires. And finally, it can be a way to monitor the categories of sea mist over the length of the shelter operations because we include sea mist in our system. So to meet the public health expectations, the aggregate morbidity, and that's what we call it, it should be done every 24 hours by the health services team. So we can be also looking for fevers, diarrhea, respiratory illness. We want to catch Norwalk virus if it comes along. And we work closely with the Center for Disease Control to analyze these data. In your local or state public health departments, they may also have a daily information sheet where they're watching for acute communicable diseases, or we actually sometimes just fax or photocopy this form and send it to the state or the local county public health department. I have a picture of it in the next slide, and actually it's just a screenshot of the top of the form, but it's enough that you can see in the upper right-hand corner where we just do hash marks. So that's why it's called aggregate, because this is an aggregation. There are no specific names. That's why you can share it with the health department, because nobody's name's on it, so it's privacy protected. But you can see through the hash marks that you can build a picture. How many people did you see in your 24 hours? How many were males and females? What were the ages? And what were the different categories of things they showed up with? Was it injuries or illnesses, mental health, chronic disease, healthcare maintenance? And at the bottom of the form, when you look at the whole form, on the bottom right-hand side is disposition. Again, the same kind of things you would expect in any kind of professional practice. Here's what we saw, and at the end, here's how many people we sent away for care. And that's important quality assurance data because we want to know, are we preventing surge into the healthcare system? Usually the healthcare systems are already impacted, at least a little bit from the disaster, and it's helpful if Red Cross can demonstrate that we are keeping people outside of the healthcare system unnecessarily by the care that we deliver. Okay, what about our standards and procedures? When you come to work with the Red Cross in a shelter or join as a volunteer, you learn about the health services standards and procedures. And this is really the base document for our practice. It describes guidelines and procedures for activities, and it gives us operational knowledge and support for performing health assessments, providing surveillance, identifying client and population needs, ensuring a healthy environment, and providing services in the shelter. It doesn't teach you how to be a nurse. It merely is the guidance on policy and practice, just like you would have in any other professional setting. Let's talk about partnerships. So this is a list of some of the types of people that Red Cross works in partnership with on a regular basis. I would like you to pause the recording and make a list of the groups that you would partner with in your community. And when you're done thinking or writing, push play to hear from our experience. Some of the experiences of the Red Cross in working with partners might be obtaining free glasses from the Lions Club, although we also have a relationship with a company called VSP, who helps us with glasses. You might find that you can get durable medical equipment from the veterans of foreign wars. Might not really think about going down to the VFW, but it's fairly common that the spouses of veterans, when they pass away, will bring the hospital bed, the walker, the wheelchair, and donate them to the American Legion or the VFW. So those kind of things happen. So what's the summary of our course at this time? The Red Cross Disaster Health Services work is very much public health nursing. But to be linked into that, you need to be familiar with your Red Cross chapter. In public health nursing, you're doing assessment and care of individuals, families, and communities, and our work is based on principles of public health nursing. So where can I go from here? At your local Red Cross chapter, you can register, and they will do a background check. That's fairly common. And then you are plugged into a training system where all the courses, almost all the courses are free, almost all the courses are online, and in some states they're actually available for CEUs. So even if you start now as a volunteer, as you progress to your professional license, in some states the Red Cross courses are actually CEU or CME eligible. So some of the classes you could take are shelter operations, mass care, CPR. You can take the more advanced version of the health service response course, psychological first aid. There's client casework, and there's a documentation system that's a computer-based system. So there's lots of things and many, many more. There's humanitarian aid, there's logistics, there's all kinds of courses. It's really a great, great resource, the learning platform at Red Cross. Again, and it's all free. So to come to the conclusion here, what do you do if you have questions? How do you do this? Well, there's a couple ways you can find help. You can go to redcross.org and type nursing in the search box, and that will take you to a page with access to resources. Or you can just go to your local chapter and input your zip code in the top right-hand corner at www.redcross.org, and that will tell you where the local chapter is, and you can get connected that way. The application to become a volunteer is online. And I know as students right now, you're feeling like there is not one more thing I can do. I don't think I can volunteer, but I can assure you that one of the greatest things about being a volunteer, in addition to being able to say yes, is you can say no. So you can find that place in Red Cross where you find a place in your heart where you can say yes and volunteer some time, and it doesn't need to consume your whole life. And so for the last slide, I just want to emphasize that I believe Red Cross Nursing is a great future opportunity. Thank you for taking part one of this two-part course. And in order to finish, you'll need to click on this link or return to the website where you started to get component number 3, which is your post-test. When you take the post-test and finish it and complete it with success, you will be able to get a certificate that says you completed part 1. And many of your faculty will have asked you to complete part 1 post-test, print the certificate, and bring it to class as evidence that you of proof of your completion. And then in your classroom, we will do part 2, which is an in-classroom tabletop exercise. And you really will be able to apply the information you've learned here in part 1 to the tabletop exercise. And you should be able and ready to help your community in disaster, even now as a student. So thank you for your kind attention, and good luck on the post-test.